Hello, I'm Sadie Groom. I'm the Managing Director of Bubble Agency. I'm pleased to say I'm the new co-chair of the PRCA Sports Group, working alongside James. My agency looks after B2B clients in the sports, media, entertainment space. And I'm really pleased to be working on this group. Our next event is going to be in April, so watch all the group details on social media for more information on that. I'm now going to hand over to our speakers for this event. Audio in any PR communications channel is really important. And having spoken to Sophie before, I didn't know half as much about it as I thought I should running a PR agency. So Voiceworks are great. They can tell us all about this, and they also, more importantly, have a sports division. So they're going to tell us all about that. So I'm now going to hand over to Sophie and Jim, and I look forward to hearing what they're going to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Sadie. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen and then introduce myself. So I'm Sophie Hind. I'm the Managing Director of Voiceworks. And I think the best way to describe what we do is we're a voice technology and audio content business. I'm here today with Jim, our head of sport, who you'll be hearing from shortly. So what we wanted to try and share with you today, I guess, is our view of what's going on in the market at the moment. So what are the opportunities for voice and audio content if you're either working with a rights holder or an individual athlete? So I will talk a bit about how we see the market now and what's happening, and then Jim will give you a bit more of the detail about things you can do, who's doing it well, and the opportunities that we see. We want this to be really relaxed. We're happy to take as many questions as you like at the end. So we've probably got about 30 minutes of content and then we'll take questions from there. So I think the best place to start is to think about what's gone on overall. And it's kind of what led us to set up Voiceworks in the first place, really. So Jim and I are both from a broadcasting background. There's been a huge explosion in audio listening over the last few years, not least from the growth of podcasts. I can remember in radio, everyone was saying audio is dying, but actually the opposite's happened. So there's this glut of kind of audio content. And at the same time, there's been the rise of voice technology through things like voice assistants. So new channels and new ways to deliver new content for brands and for rights holders. And I imagine most of you that are watching this have probably got smart devices in your home. You may have smart homes, you may have Alexa speakers or Google speakers, and I would imagine as well that an awful lot of you are podcast listeners too. So people are consuming audio, but also searching for information in completely different ways now. So through voice, and that has led to some real challenges for a lot of brands, because if you're discovering a brand without the benefit of any visuals, how you sound is really, really important. And many brands and many rights holders haven't really thought about their audio brand guidelines yet, but you need to start thinking about how to take control of how you sound as well as how you look, because I think we've all spent years focusing on our kind of visual assets. When I think about audio branding, I have two favorite examples. One is Netflix, because I love the little doo-doom when I'm about to watch something, because it kind of usually fills me with excitement, and that's my me time. And the other one that I love, which is an iconic example, is probably the Champions League music. Again, kind of exciting and uplifting. But we're not going to focus too much on audio branding today. We're going to focus more on content and the kind of behavior changes that we're seeing right now. So we at Voiceworks work very closely with Amazon and Google, and they've been telling us for some time that they're getting more requests for sport information via their smart speakers than almost anything else. And yet there's a lack of content. They want Alexa to be able to answer any query, and there's a real lack of content out there. So what can you do to take control of this? I think that sports organisations have some of the highest value content available, really strong in TV, in video, in digital, and that's obviously where the main focus has been for the last few years. But we talk to a lot of rights holders, and the kind of audio content monetization strategies are almost non-existent at the moment. Yet audio is a perfect way to deepen engagement with fans, to give your audience easily consumable content in small bite-sized chunks. If you've got fans around the world that want to interact with you, video can be quite hard to consume depending on what data packages you have available. So it's a really cost-effective way to create direct-to-fan engagement and communicate. And if you're an athlete and you want to grow your personal brand or establish yourself as a leader in a field, or communicate on a deeper level, again, audio is a really effective way for you to do that. So I'm just going to have a look at where we are now. I'm starting with podcasts, which is only one part of the puzzle, but a big part of audio consumption, I guess. And there's getting close to 2 million podcasts out there now around the world. In the UK, over 15 million of us listen to podcasts every week. That's grown from 6 million, just over 2 years ago. So the growth trajectory is huge. And who's listening? A few years back, I think that podcast listeners, it was the domain of the kind of 30-something male. It was quite a trendy thing to do. Now, everybody and anybody listens to podcasts. Demographically, there's something out there for everyone, whether it's informational, entertainment-led, but you can reach any kind of audience you want to. There's, I think, 43 million podcast episodes live as of January this year, and about 34 million pounds in ad revenue was spent on podcasting. And then when you look at sport as an area for opportunity, around about 40% of podcast listening is to sport. And yet very little of that is rights holder official content. A lot of it is driven by kind of fan type content. So if we move on from podcasting to smart speakers, this is an area that's just rocketing. So I think these figures are massively underrepresented. Before we went into lockdown, we were doing lots of large live events around the country. And if we did a show of hands in the room at that point, you'd probably get about 70 to 80% of people saying they have a smart speaker in their home, or probably several smart speakers. But it's at least a third of UK homes, which is around about 16 million users. Voice is giving an opportunity for an interactive experience, but I think an important thing to remember as well is voice doesn't always mean screenless. There are now Echo shows, so lots of devices out there that have an opportunity for visual branding as well. We created an Alexa skill for a client just at the end of last year, which contained a huge amount of video as well as audio. So depending how you accessed it, you could get an audio only experience or a video experience as well. But voice is everywhere. So I always think that smart speakers take up kind of far too much of the spotlight. When we talk about voice, we really mean the actual digital assistant, which is already in every device. So my car has voice activation. You have smart TVs, and what a genius invention that is, that you can actually change the channel by voice now. You don't even have to press a button. You can use your laptop, your tablet, your phone, wearables. So it's absolutely everywhere. And I think the reason that voice has taken hold so quickly and will continue to grow is it's a very natural way for us to do things. And there's never been a better time probably than a pandemic, where we don't want to touch anything. We want to be able to control things with our voice. But as human beings, it's a very natural way for us to interact. It's very different to searching with Google, where we all learned a language that we could type. We all learned how to type search terms without even realizing it. And now we can just talk to things and they talk back to us and serve us with information. There's 500 million people a month using Google in about 90 countries. And there's 100 million devices now with Alexa built in. So this technology is not going anywhere. It's predicted that by 2023, there'll be 8.6 billion devices with voice built in. So I guess what this takes us to is the kind of voice first movement that everybody talks about. And this is the really exciting part for us. What it means is there's new content platforms that you can design your audio for. Primarily, it's probably best to think of it as screenless first and then work out how you can build screen into that. But it's really impacted how we as individuals interact. And if you have a smart speaker in your kitchen, then it tends to be more of a family listen. There's a real trend towards short form content. So we produce a lot of news-based updates for our clients, flash briefings. In the morning when you get up, you kind of want that short, sharp information news. So it's almost like another social media platform, except that you can have a conversation. So if you think of what a website gives you, and then you think about what a voice platform can give you, it can probably give you most of what a website can give you, but it can also give you a two-way conversation. And then layer on top of that, the values of audio, which is, all the qualities that radio and podcasts give you, which is a kind of intimate medium, a very direct medium, a medium that can bring emotion to life, and it gives you a really exciting proposition. So I'm going to hand over to Jim now, who's going to talk a bit more about how that can come to life within a sports environment.
Hi. So we know that the modern sports fan now demands more than just game day content. We know they want to interact with their favourite teams, and want to hear from their favourite sporting figures right the way through the week. At the moment, we're in something that's been dubbed recently the third age of sport. And when we talk about the third age of sport, what we talk about is the digital age, where new technologies are coming in and they're disrupting the way we traditionally consume sports content. This is largely being driven at the moment by mobile phones, and it's been massively accelerated over the last 12 months by the COVID crisis as well, in terms of the way we are consuming audio and consuming content, and audio is going to be a massive part of that. So sport media on the whole is a really saturated market at the moment. You just have to go and browse around the internet and you'll find YouTube videos, there's TV highlights packages on television, there's a dizzying amount of live games at the moment. The Premier League seems to be on every night of the week, much to my wife's disgust. But even though there's this massive content available out there, there still seems to be a thirst for more content from fans. The challenge is finding space to deliver that content to those fans. And audio is a great medium for finding that space in audiences' lives, mainly because it can be a second activity. So it can be an accompanying a media, and it can be something that's used as you're doing other things. So people consume podcasts on their commute. They listen to Alexa updates while they're having a coffee in the morning. They might listen to a longer podcast while they're on a run. So we can consider how you consume audio within your busy week of your life. Say, as a football fan, how would they consume audio throughout a week? Obviously, there's the tentpole match day event. That's always going to be important in a sports fan's life, wherever that sits. The match day, the game is always going to be important, but we can spread that engagement throughout the week as well with different content. Saturday morning before kickoff, they might ask Alexa to deliver the latest team news before they head to meet their mates in the pub, when we could go to the pub. Monday night after work, they might go for a jog, listen to a podcast, get a debrief on the action from the weekend. Midweek, they might want a bit of me time away from work. So they want to listen to a long form interview with maybe a former player from the club, something that's a little bit more engaging, a little bit more intimate, something they can do whilst they're cooking dinner. So there's different audio strategies that can hit an audience at different parts of their week, and different audio forms that can fit into that different lifestyle as well. Now, I've been talking about pure sport focus. That's without even considering how an audio strategy can cross into other genres, such as music playlists as well. There's no reason why a curated music playlist couldn't form part of an audio strategy. And you can begin to see how those little gaps in people's lives can be filled with even more content. Because audio is less demanding as well than, say, video in terms of attention spans, it means you get much better consumption numbers than video. So if you look at Facebook, for example, they class a view as someone watching 3 seconds of a video. For podcasting, if we take that as a comparison, the average listen through rate to a 45-minute podcast is around 75-80%. So you're getting 30 minutes of someone's solid attention compared to the 3 seconds that you get via a Facebook video. So who's done it well so far? What's the market look like at the moment? Here's the bad news first. If you do want to take advantage of all audio's superpowers, then you're not going to be the first person to do so. There's a few people out there who are doing some really interesting things and who have benefited from the space already. So Peter Crouch is someone we've got to mention. He's a man who's built a post-football career that you'd argue could be more successful than his football career. He was a mid-table footballer, but in terms of media value, I think he's probably Champions League. So he launched a podcast with the BBC. Now, when they launched this podcast, the BBC, as much as they claim they know it was going to be successful, they had no idea it was going to be the monster it turned out to be. And I imagine from Peter Crouch's point of view, it wasn't a particularly calculated move in terms of where it was going to get him in his career. But the way he presented himself in that podcast was this very intimate medium, a very open, personable individual. And it was something that was really unique when it came to the media-trained, sanitized world of Premier League footballers. So he was presenting himself in a really honest, laid-bare way that gave him a real niche and a real value in the audio space and the media space as well. So off the back of this podcast, and the podcast now gets 12 million listens a year, which is an incredible number, that's now led him into live shows for the podcast, into TV shows, and essentially a media empire that's all built up from this one place in terms of his podcast. FIFA Sounds is a new project that's been launched by FIFA. They've recently got in on the action of audio, and FIFA have taken a really interesting approach to their audio strategy. They've realized that if you want to create a successful sport brand, you need to think of more than just sport. And they've gone at audio with the ambition of creating a lifestyle brand. So we're in a world where quite often sports stars have bigger social media followings than the clubs they play for. And it's not just people like your Ronaldos either that falls down to. There's the likes of Said Benrahma at West Ham, Riyad Mahrez at Manchester City, who when they've signed for the clubs have brought with them a whole new fan base, mainly from their home countries, who are much more interested in the individual than the team. And it's not just down to geography, it's down to how relatable individuals are as well. When you think about the way people interact with pop stars in a completely different way to the way they interact with brands, for example. It's the same with players and with football teams. If you can tap into someone's fashion or music or lifestyle, that's much easier to buy into than a great big faceless brand. And that's a challenge for someone like FIFA, because FIFA don't have players. FIFA are a big faceless governing body. They can't show everyone what's in their wardrobe. In fact, in the case of FIFA, if they showed people what was in their wardrobe, it would probably lead to all kinds of legal cases. So it wouldn't be the best idea. So instead of showing people what's in their wardrobe, they're showing people what's in other people's wardrobes. And they've launched their audio strategy by tapping in on music. Now, one of the first things they've done is they've got Liam Payne, who I think was in One Direction. And he hosts a podcast talking about the relationship between football and the relationship with football and music. So he's tapping into player playlists, pre-match music. FIFA already have a bit of a heritage here in terms of the soundtracks they have on their EA Sports games. So it's kind of a natural fit. But they've looked outside of their sport to establish their audio strategy. So the third person I've got on the list is the Joe Wicks, who, along with Jeff Bezos, I think is the man who has benefited most from lockdown over the last 12 months. Now, there's very few individuals who have promoted their personal brand via the Alexa platform, and Joe Wicks is someone who's done this brilliantly with the body coach skill. Now, what he did when he thought about how he was going to be on the Alexa platform is the one thing that you need to do when you're deciding whether an Alexa skill is the right way for you to go with your audio strategy, is he established a need. He worked out something that he thought would be genuinely useful for his audience, and that happened to be audio hit sessions. So watching YouTube isn't for everyone. So he created an audio guide that could motivate you through your stay-at-home work, which not only is a useful product for his audience, but also enforces absolutely everything about the personal brand he's trying to create. What I think is really interesting about Joe Wicks and the body coach skill is where he can take it next. What does the future hold? Amazon as a platform is ultimately a shopping channel. So the easiest thing to do via skills is to sell something. So it would be really interesting to see if Joe Wicks then adds in functionality in his skill that allows people to, example, maybe purchase premium products, or more likely purchase one of his cookbooks, or purchase some of his branded gym equipment. And that can all happen in a real frictionless transaction, because ultimately, if you're using a smart speaker and you want something from it, all you have to do is ask the question and you're delivered that product. It's not a massive chain of events with clicking and tick boxes and all that kind of thing. So where does audio go from here? We know that podcasting is growing massively. Year on year, we're seeing huge growth across the UK. We tend to look at the US when we want to see what's happening in podcasting, and that has shown massive growth over the last 10 years. We tend to be 18 months or so behind the US in terms of where they hit and the marks they hit. So we're seeing a glimpse of the potential in the UK market in the US at the moment, but it's more than just growth we're expecting to see. Formats of audio are changing slowly. In the podcasting world alone, Spotify entering the market in the last 12 months has massively changed listening patterns for audiences. People are listening to much more shorter content than they were before. This is happening for two reasons. One, the Spotify audience base is a little bit younger. They may not be used to listening to podcasts. They're used to consuming playlists and music. So attention spans are a little bit shorter. And so podcast lengths are coming down. Also, they create playlists on Spotify. So their platform is designed to consume multiple audio from multiple providers in a curated playlist. And they've actively encouraged this by introducing things like news playlists with a series of very short 5-minute, 10-minute podcasts from providers that give you a complete kind of long form listen, but with many shorter podcasts making up that listen. Voice assistants, as Sophie was saying as well, they've contributed to a trend on short form listening as well as the family communal listen that Sophie was talking about. What happens next will be really interesting in terms of voice assistants, because at the moment we think of them as these little boxes, Alexa and Google in the corner of the room, that kind of sit there and we interact with. Increasingly, they're coming everywhere. So they're in your phone, they're in your headphones, they're in your TV, they're in your car. And no doubt that is going to start to shape audio more than we're seeing at the moment. So we need to start thinking about what those specific audiences are going to demand from a piece of audio content or a podcast listen. Will a car driver listen differently to a piece of audio than a jogger, for example? What specific needs will they have? Right now, we don't really know what impact that's going to have. It's a bit of crystal ball glazing, but we do know it is going to have an impact in the future. And the good news for everyone is there is increased spend in advertising in podcasts at the moment. Year on year, it's been growing for a long time. The UK made £10.5 million of the podcast industry in 2017. That was the advertising spend. This year, it's 34 million. So last year it's 34 million. And then in 3 years' time, it's predicted to be 74.5 million. That total's supposed to be at. So it's growing exponentially, which is good. And we're also seeing the types of brands that are interested in podcasting developing. If you listen to podcasts, you'll know about two things. You'll know about MailChimp and you'll know about Wix website building. Recently, we've seen bigger and bigger brands take bigger and bigger slices of the podcasting pie and put serious investment into audiences that they know are not only super engaged, but also incredibly targeted. Because the way podcasting works, it's not like television or radio where you're taking small numbers and you're extrapolating them out to give people an idea of what their audience is. With podcasting, you're able to present an exact audience, an exact age demographic, an exact sex as well in terms of who your audience is, and that's got a massive value. The platform side of things is also going to lead to exclusive content, and there's going to be a big change there as well. So traditionally podcasts have been a bit of a free-for-all. People make content, they put them on every platform, they try and get a big audience, and they try and build some ad revenue in that way. At the moment, we're going to see podcast platforms like Spotify and Apple and Audio Boom try and monetize in a different way. Potentially, it could be like a pay-as-you-go. You pay 79p to listen to your favorite podcast or whatever it is basis. But I think because of the heritage that podcasting has and people associate it with a free listen, I think the companies that try and monetize that way are going to struggle. I think the more interesting way, and the way that we as audio creators can take advantage, is that a lot of podcast groups are going to look at exclusivity deals with podcasts that have good engaged audiences and bring them over to the platform. So we saw last year Audible signed Steve Coogan to make Alan Partridge podcasts. We saw Spotify spend a ridiculous amount of money on signing Joe Rogan to an exclusivity deal on their platform. And they see this as a way to attract users, convince users to sign up for their premium accounts on the platform, which have a subscription fee, but also by having people listening via their apps and their platforms, it also gives them enhanced user data on who their audience is that they can then in turn sell to their sponsors in terms of getting more ad revenue in for themselves. There's rumors are at the moment that Apple are developing a subscription podcast platform right now as well. So we're going to see in the future this turf war over the most popular shows and the biggest shows and the shows with the most engaged audiences going forward. So are you ready to go? If you're thinking about taking a dive into the deep end here, there's a few things that you need to consider before you actually start making your podcast. First, what is your brand? How do you want to be seen? If you're an ex-sports star, do you want to be seen as an expert in your field, or do you want to be seen as a personality like Peter Crouch who transcends their sport and touches on other areas? Just because you're a former cricket star, for example, doesn't mean you can't build a profile with audio that maybe associates you with travel or food or whatever your passion happens to be. You don't have to stay in your lane when it comes to audio. Who's your audience? Who do you want to appeal to? Do you want to appeal to your existing audience, the people that remember you? Again, if you're a sports star as a player, do you want to super serve that existing audience and bring them in tighter to your brand? Or do you want to establish yourself in front of a newer audience? Do you want to talk to a younger audience? And if so, how do you talk to them? Who you want to talk to and how you talk to that person is probably as, if not more important, as what you are going to say when it comes to making your own podcast or expanding your audio brand. The next question is, what style is your show going to be? There's a myriad of different options here. There's no right answer, but is it informative? Is it funny? Does it educate? Does it entertain? Does it inform? Is it topical content that burns really quickly, gets a really big audience a couple of days after an event, but then in 2 weeks' time is irrelevant? Or is it evergreen content, like a long form interview that can be there for 4 years, slowly gathering an audience and slowly picking up listens? Those answers will probably be influenced by the first two questions. And again, there is no right answer, although it does help if you can find a niche here. If you can find something that no one else is doing, or you think you can do better than anyone else. And if you can find that niche, you will find an audience there as well. And finally, what platform is it that suits your product? Podcasting is kind of the go-to platform when it comes to audio content at the moment. It's easy, it's cheap, you can get started and test the water. But as we've outlined, there are so many different platforms that will suit a myriad of different styles. There's voice tech, there's Amazon, there's web-based audio that you can host on a website, there's short form content, there's long form content. Again, it's something that will be influenced by the way you've answered the previous questions in terms of how you approach that. All of them are pros and cons and all can form part of an audio strategy that all depends on what it is you're trying to achieve and who your audience is.
Thanks, Jim. So I guess to pull it all together, as Jim's outlined, if you're working with an athlete or a sports star, there are individual strategies that can be developed around podcasting, short form, long form audio. If you're a rights holder, we work with rights holders to help them develop their audio strategy, and there are staged ways of doing that. So integrating audio into your existing digital strategy as a starting point, and then starting to develop new content and new channels using voice technology. There are some massive economies of scale because you can repurpose content you already have. So we can repurpose video into new audio or magazine style podcasts. There's monetization options depending where you want to go with it. So creating new audio inventory or creating a podcast, we can help monetize that, or are there many ways you can monetize that if that's your strategy. You have to grow an audience first, but you can use your social media following as a way of promoting that audience to help drive that more quickly. There's things like premium content that you can look at, and clearly e-commerce and commercial opportunities as well. So there's a massive amount of opportunity, and I think the most important thing is there is a huge urgency here. Audio and voice technology is not going anywhere. It's getting bigger and bigger, and whether you're an individual, a tournament, whether it's the Olympics, whether it's Wimbledon, whether it's a golf tournament, or a club that's playing week in, week out, or an individual, there are consumers out there who are looking for information and asking for information via voice. And if there is no audio available at the moment, they will either be served a "I don't know that one" from the voice assistant, or a horrible clunky piece of voice assistant trying to read out something from a Wikipedia page. So a huge opportunity there, and we're really happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. That was super interesting, and I can't believe there are that. Well, I sort of can, but can't really believe there are that many podcasts out there. So one question that I had was, as a PR person, what's the best way to get coverage on a podcast? So obviously, if it's for, we're trying to get coverage in a magazine or on a TV show, we pitch to the editors. Who do we go to? Do we go to production companies? And then how do we find them? Rather than starting our own podcast for our clients, where do we go?
So do you mean if your client had a podcast, or you want to get them as a guest on a podcast?
If they wanted to be a guest on someone else's podcast.
Yeah, I think in that instance, it's probably about looking at who are the leaders in whatever category you're interested in and approaching the production company. There are people like Spotify are also commissioning new content as well in certain categories. But Jim, how would you add to that?
Yeah, it's podcasting is still in a weird place at the moment, slightly in terms of that stuff, because it's a little bit of the Wild West. It's so many indies who are kind of creating their own titles that it's very difficult to kind of go to one place and get blanket coverage across a number of titles. It's one of the reasons we set up the podcast network that we're launching, is that it does mean that we can talk to individuals, be they people looking for press coverage, or be it looking for clients who can kind of buy up space around a number of titles and a series of podcasts. So it can be just kind of identifying the particular podcasts or audiences you want to go after and contacting those individuals direct. In a similar way to radio, however, I think podcasters are very aware of the value that their shows have in general. And there's a bit of a kind of a black market in guest exchange that goes on in some areas, where you can't just go and be a guest on a podcast, particularly if you're going in there with a PR angle. That people do look for some kind of financial gain in return. But depending on who the individual is, what it is you're talking about, like if it was a new flavor of crisps, for example, you'll probably struggle to get someone to have you on your podcast. But if it's a new flavor of crisps advertised via, I don't know, Ryan Reynolds, then it's a different game, than people are more than happy to kind of take the commercial hit in terms of having the guest on the podcast that potentially expands their audience.
I've got a couple of questions from the audience. So firstly, how might syndication work with podcasts? Can it be used to grow audiences effectively?
Interesting. So what we've noticed, particularly in sport, and this isn't meant to be a shameless plug, is that it's very hard for there's so many sport podcasts out there, and it's quite hard for them to grow their audience and monetize themselves. So as Jim alluded, we're going to launch our own sport network at the end of this month, where we're offering sports podcasters of any size to join our platform. We'll host them, and it's all about the scale. So we will cross-promote podcasts on our network. Within our network, we will promote them on above the line media. We'll do guest sharing, And we'll also give them access to monetization, because what we're going to create is a much larger audience than those individual podcasts can provide, that we can sell to advertisers. But that's one part of it. Jim, anything else on syndication?
I mean, it depends what type of syndication we're talking about. I know there's a growing trend for people to kind of syndicate their podcast audio to other platforms in order to kind of raise awareness of their podcasts and their products. There's various radio stations that will take syndicated podcasts, for example. There's dedicated podcast radio channels now that all take syndicated podcasts. And I think ultimately it can increase awareness of shows and it can drive audience, but the consumption methods are so different that you're relying on a big leap between. So if for example, the way people listen to radio, they don't turn on at 1 o'clock when a show might start, where they might catch the title and the delivery method of a podcast. They're more likely to turn on at 10 past the hour when it's deep in a conversation, and turn on at 20 past the hour before that conversation's even ended. So your chance of cross promotion and your chance of branding that are quite slim. I think it's a much more, if you're focusing on podcast promotion and growing audiences, it's much more sensible to make that leap, that extra click, as simple as possible. So using social media in a clever way with audiograms and snippets of audio to drive your audience that way. So it is literally a click away, using things like voice technology where someone can literally ask for the podcast immediately off the back of hearing something. One of the things we do we have an Alexa skill that offers sports news, and will give you an update on every Premier League team, wherever your team is. One of the things we do is, after you've consumed a piece of content, a 60-second report on Chelsea, off the back of that, you're immediately offered our daily podcast. So there's an automatic step, there's an easy flow to that experience. Whereas if you're syndicating content to a completely different medium, you're relying on someone, A, hearing your podcast name, B, remembering that podcast name 20 minutes, 30 minutes later when they get back to a desktop or on their phone, being able to search that again. It's just a lot of different steps.
Yeah, it's like writing down that when your mates say you must watch this Netflix show or read this book, and you go into your notes and you put them in there, don't you? So
interesting. That's the way that podcasts have the best growth, is personal recommendations. I mean, with anything, any kind of brand, that's the most valuable thing. You'll hear, if you listen to podcasts, you'll hear people saying, tell your mates about this show. And there's a reason for that. It's the most valuable way that shows can grow. And it's small increments. You need a lot of people to tell a lot of other people to see any big growth, but it really works.
It really works. A couple of questions about advertising. You obviously talked about Wix and MailChimp. Does their ubiquity in I'm on Oxford Street and now does their ubiquity in podcasting harm other advertisers? So is there a risk that their monopoly will turn people off?
Yeah, interesting one. I mean, I think, as with any medium, you don't want a few brands to totally dominate, do you? I think that if you listen to these sort of IAB conferences, both in the UK and the US, and listen, the podcast as an advertising medium is further developed in the US, as is voice. Over here, though, more and more advertisers are really starting to take it seriously as a medium. And I think what's been difficult in the past has just been that access to audiences at scale. So the likes of Acast and DAX and Audio Boom have started to solve that issue, in terms of being able to offer different verticals and, a mass of different podcasts grouped together, which is the same thing that we're trying to do for sport. So yeah, I think it is a tricky one. And as a listener, you don't want to hear the same ads over and over and over again. So let's hope that the growth in podcast advertising that's forecast continues, because I think but obviously as a podcaster, you can choose not to take advertising. You don't have to take it, and you can choose the number of ad markers that you put in there as well.
I think we're seeing a lot more diversity in adverts now. It is growing, it is changing, so it isn't as dominated by Beer 52 or Wix or MailChimp or whoever it happens to be that particular week. So we are on Manscaped, that's the new one on the market. So we are seeing a bit of diversity there. What's really interesting about podcast audiences is there was a report released probably a year ago now, called Super Listeners, and it was about people who consumed more than, I forget the exact number, I think it was more than 3.5 hours of podcasting a week, and how they reacted to adverts within podcasts. And the way podcast listeners consume adverts on podcasts is completely different to the way they consume adverts on television. People who watch adverts on television, they see them as an inconvenience, an opportunity to go to the loo or to make a cup of tea or whatever it is. People who listen to adverts in podcasts almost appreciate the fact that an advertiser is there helping them bring them a podcast for free, which is part of the challenge that when I talk about these networks wanting to ring fence content and go for pay-as-you-go schemes, it's part of the challenge that they face. Is this kind of free content is so ingrained in podcasting, they've got to overcome that. So almost there's a halo effect that an advertiser has from an audience, that they view that product in a more, that could supply in a more positive light because they're connected with their favorite podcaster who they have this really intimate, deep relationship with. So yeah, it's a really interesting space, advertising, but I think that kind of relationship kind of overcomes that swamping, if you like, of a product.
So a couple of questions on content. Firstly, what are platforms and networks doing to filter the content they offer to be seen as a good, solid source of high production value rather than a home to all?
Well, they're not. So if you look at someone like, podcast networks like Acast and Audio Boom are mainly concerned with one thing, and that's the amount of listeners a podcast has. Their focus is ultimately making revenue. So the gatekeeper for them is the numbers, essentially. And I guess in a perfect world, those numbers are your gatekeeper to audio as well, the quality. So a podcast that has good numbers should, in theory, be a good quality podcast. We're approaching our network slightly differently. We're not necessarily only opening it up to big podcasts. We're looking at smaller, maybe more niche podcasts as well. At the moment, we're able to, because we're at the early stages of our product, we're able to filter those podcasts ourselves and listen and judge things on what we believe to be good. But in terms of the wider picture, in terms of kind of the podcast market and what limitations or what rules and regulations there are around podcasts, there ultimately aren't any. There's rules in terms of copyright, but it's very much up to the podcaster to observe them, and if they get caught, it's their issue. And the same goes with things like libel and racism. It's a real. It's a perfect example of a media that has accelerated much quicker than the regulations around it, and in a similar way to social media has. I think in the next 12 months we'll see that changing massively. I think Ofcom, certainly in the UK, will be taking a more heavy-handed role in looking after that stuff. But yeah, it's not a particularly policed area. So in terms of quality, if it's part of a network, it's very much up to the network to judge that. But in terms of podcasting on the whole, there's no quality filter at all.
And a similar-ish question around voice assistants. So how would we ensure that our sports news information is easily accessible for voice assistants?
Well, I think the first thing would be to have some audio versions of it. So if it's something that you've got on a website, for example, create voiced versions of it. Human voiced would be our recommendation, not kind of text to speech. And you can do really simple things with voice assistants, like the flash briefing we referred to. So a skill on Alexa is effectively a voice app, which takes a bit more development, but a flash briefing is a really easy way to create a piece of audio content, make it accessible as part of someone's routine. Jim can probably explain more because he's created them. I haven't, but
yeah. So flash briefings are kind of like mini news bulletins that people can create up to 15 minutes long. And then Alexa have developed a kind of process called a routine, as Sophie said, which enables you to essentially kind of tailor your own playlist of that content in the morning. So you can trigger that routine however you like. It could be that the moment you turn on an Amazon connected device, so say for example a light in your room, the moment you turn on the light in your room, it triggers your smart speaker to deliver 5-minute news updates that are based as flash briefings. So yeah, that's one way to kind of take your first steps into this audio world. The other is building kind of bigger multifunctional skills, which are kind of like phone apps ultimately, and having them based on your Alexa platform or your Google Home platform. The kind of golden egg of all this at the moment is being able to say to a smart speaker, tell me about pizza, and your pizza brand to be the first thing it returns. Because unlike screen-based search, where you get a multitude of returns, with voice search, you get one return. And at the moment, it's not a sponsored world. It's not, so you can't buy that position 0. And that's a really interesting side of this technology at the moment, because I don't think anyone's quite worked out how that's going to look at the moment and how you become that position 0. At the moment, it tends to be Wikipedia that returns that answer. I think because the bods at Amazon have decided that that's where the richest information will come from. It will come from ultimately an encyclopedia, but that is slowly changing. And so our recommendations in that area is to get yourself ready. And it's kind of like when websites launched. If you were early building a website, that paid dividends when search engines started to look for the content. In a similar place to voices at the moment, voice search is going to look for the websites that are best prepared for delivering voice content. And whether that's, as Sophie says, having audio versions of your web pages on your site, whether it's having even a podcast, because we know now that Apple Podcasts have just launched a load of software that allows you to audio search within a podcast audio. So you've got an hour-long audio. If you want to hear the latest news on, I don't know, battered sausages or whatever it happens to be, you can actually search for that particular term within a podcast and just someone mentioning that podcast. And that's only available for a very small amount of podcasts at the moment, but it gives you an idea of where the future's going. And if someone was to ask a smart speaker for a certain piece of content, we know that at some point in the future, we don't know how long that rollout's going to be, it could search the web for that phrase in audio somewhere. So yeah, it's a little bit of guesswork at the moment, and it's a little bit of theory, and there's certain things you can do to prepare, but you can't expect to be straight away position 0 in this world at the moment.
So somebody has asked, is SEO keyword research critical to voice search?
Yes. Again, it's kind of it's an in development area of this stuff at the moment. It's something that we're constantly exploring and looking for more information on and more clues on. It's very much based on traditional SEO at the moment, but the difference between traditional SEO and voice SEO is the way people ask for things. As Sophie said, we've kind of trained ourselves to Google in a certain way, but you don't ask a question the same way as you Google it. You wouldn't say to a smart speaker, pizza near me. That you'd say, Alexa, tell me where my nearest pizza restaurant is. Yeah. So it's kind of like looking at your SEO in a slightly different way. And then, as I said, kind of preparing the audio content that is delivered off the back of that to be right.
Yeah. I think the sort of best advice we have at the moment is, in the same way as in traditional search. But if you're thinking of it in audio and voice terms, it's anticipate questions and provide answers. And a great place to start is kind of, what would those FAQs be? Or if it's news content, what's the most popular? And maybe, start creating audio versions of that.
Yeah, brilliant. Right, that was end of the questions. Anything else you want to add? Last thoughts?
I don't think so. I think we've covered a lot. But if anybody has any questions, we're always happy to just get in touch.
Yeah, that was absolutely fascinating. So thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Jim. And thank you everyone for listening.